know me. But anyway, I'm David Worley. I am one of the people who work with the setting up programs for the Marxist Education Project. And we're really happy to have here tonight Mitch Abidor, a longtime friend of ours and a great scholar of all things French and revolutionary, among other things, who has recently completed this new English translation of Jean Jaurès, A Socialist History of the French Revolution, kind of classic history that, well, he'll tell you more about it, but it's 125 years old or something like that now. And he's going to be introduced by and have a conversation with Geoff Kurtz, who is the author of a biography of Jean Jaurès. Jean Jaurès was one of the leading lights of the, I would say, of the the Socialist International, who was assassinated on the eve of World War I because of his opposition to the war. He was a member of the French, I think he was a member of the French Parliament. Well, Geoff will tell us those details. So I'm going to turn the meeting over to Geoff and mute myself. And at the end of their conversation, Geoff will manage a Q&A period. And I hope we have a good, I'm sure the program will be very interesting, and I hope we can have a little bit of discussion afterwards. So I'm going to mute myself now. Geoff.
Okay, thanks, David. I want to point out specifically that the occasion, I mean, David alluded to this, but the occasion for this event is that Mitch's translation of Jaurès' Socialist History of the French Revolution is out in a new edition, paperback edition. Is that right, Mitch? The paperback is brand new?
Right.
Yeah. That was, which is great. And it is, the Socialist History is just a gargantuan, multi-volume book that Mitch's achievement here is to turn this, shelf full of writing into this elegant, slim volume. So I'm going to ask Mitch some questions about the book and its significance, and then, as David said, we'll open it up for general conversation. So Mitch, I wanted to start with the basics. Can you tell us, please, who was Jean Jaurès?
Oh, and before we go to that, I want to say that this was an event that Michael Lardner and I, this is the last event that he set up for me. And we were talking about it even while he was sick. And, I wasn't all that anxious to do it since we'd already done a couple events, but, Michael pushed and pushed. And so I think it's a really nice tribute that, that I'm here. It's not a big deal, but that there are, that there are more people that have come to every other event we've done on Jaurès combined, shows that Michael had a good feel for what would work. And I also want to show a couple things, because can we see it here? This is just one volume of the one that's currently out, of 4 volumes of the Socialist History. So, and he wrote this between 1898 and 1909. Spit take, there we go. Scholarly spit take, there we go. So you can see that this was, this is not some minor work. And, I appreciate Geoff's compliment, my cutting it down. Pluto was very, very, very strict about how many words it could be. So I had to pick out just the principal events and things that explained his Jaurès' give a great idea of Jaurès' point of view. Also, just for those who don't know what he looked like, this is him. Great beard, typical of the period. Okay, so Jaurès. So Jaurès was born in 1859 in the south of France, and he, early on he showed, he was a brilliant young man, and so he went to the most elite school in France, the École Normale Supérieure, and his classmates, he graduated third in the class, And the person who was first was Henri Bergson. And also in that class was Emil Durkheim. So this was really quite an impressive assembly that were at the École Normale. So he moved. He came from a poor part of France, became a socialist, and at the time there were several socialist parties in France. But very early on, he was in love with the French Revolution, because the French Revolution, as we'll see when Geoff and I discuss the book, was really for him the foundation of everything. And he was very, very, very much focused on democracy and the Republic, and both of which were the outgrowths of the French Revolution. And he said in his youth, that the two essential prerequisites of socialism, democracy and capitalism, were both the results of the French Revolution. So, and as most of you would know, capitalism as a progressive movement there was nothing non-Marxist or anti-Marxist about it. Since you need capitalism to advance to socialism, it breaks the chains of the feudal society. So, but he was that even when he discussed Marx as a socialist, he said all socialism, all collectivism is not in Marx. It comes in France from French conceptions and French traditions, which included the French Revolution. So the French Revolution was really the heart of everything for him. Here we go. Okay, but also part of his ideology, and we'll discuss it further, was he was very, very, very much, even though a socialist, he was very much proud of being French, proud of French traditions. And so he said that socialists had to be internationalist and patriotic at the same time, which, for some people, it's like really difficult. How do you square that circle? But this really was, again, something that he carried all the way through up until the day that he was killed on August 1st, 1914. So, but he talked about nationalism. He said, if we French socialists were indifferent to the honor, to the security, to the prosperity of France, it would not only be a crime against the fatherland, it would also be a crime against humanity. So this is definitely a socialism that's in many ways is foreign to people at MEP, because it's so firmly rooted in the love of and the belief in France's destiny and its history and its role in history. And he even thought it was very important as a socialist to support French military might. And one of the things that's amazing things about the socialist history of the French Revolution is it took from 1898 to 1909 to write it, but in the middle of that, everything that I'm describing, his socialist activity, was all going on while he was writing this book. So it's an extraordinary accomplishment to write thousands of pages of history, doing the thorough research that he did, at the same time as he's the heart and soul of French socialism. And also, even though at the beginning he was reluctant to get involved, as so many on the left were, he was one of the key supporters of Dreyfus. And one of his books is a really important book on Dreyfus. And he even saw the defense of Dreyfus as a socialist duty, as a socialist task, because any form of injustice is what a socialist has to rise against. So let me see what I got here. Now, what's really important with Jaurès, one of the reasons I find him so admirable is that if there was anything that he hated, it was any form of sectarianism. He battled against it his entire political life. And there's a great story. Jaurès believed that socialists could participate in bourgeois governments. And there were those who opposed that. But because the Republic was essential in order for there to be socialism, he believed that socialists had to keep the Republic strong when it's being attacked by clericalism, especially during the Dreyfus era. And this became a hot topic in the World Socialist Movement. And in 1904, at the International Conference, Jaurès defended the position. No, I'm sorry, he was going to be defending the position. Rosa Luxemburg attacked it. And when Jaurès got up to speak, he couldn't speak German. So they needed somebody to do the interpretation and interpret what he was saying into German, translate it into German. And Rosa Luxemburg, who he was about to attack at his talk and who had just attacked him, volunteered to do it. And Jaurès' reaction was that even in battle, there is cooperation. And in fact, in this fight, in which he lost in the International Socialist Movement, again, it's a model of political conduct, and it's why I admire Jaurès so much, that when his position lost, he accepted defeat. That if it was, the International had decided that the socialists shouldn't participate in governments, what he did was he went home and he unified all the various socialist parties into one and founded L'Humanité, the party newspaper, which still exists today. It's been the Communist Party newspaper since 1920. But he never, ever, he was not the kind of guy who was going to take his ball and bat and go home. He believed in democracy, even within, or especially within, the socialist movement. Okay, so to not have this go on for too long, because we have to talk about the books. His most controversial positions, even now for many people, is his position around World War I. And he was assassinated while he was sitting in a cafe, the Café Croissant. There's a big plaque there. You can go visit it. Rue du Faubourg Poissonnière, I think. And he was assassinated by a right-wing activist. But his position was not one very popular on the left, because he believed that France had to defend itself, that whoever was the aggressor in this war, which is obviously he said was going to be Germany and Austria, it was the duty of French socialists to defend the republic. And if you think about his position, France was a republic. That if you look at all the countries around it, every single one of them was a monarchy. Belgium, Germany, Italy were all, not Switzerland, we'll have to skip over that. But France was surrounded by monarchies. And so he believed that the defeat of France would have been the defeat of a republic, and it would have been a setback not just for France, but for the human race, for humanity rather. So he was planning to have a huge peace conference. It was cut short because he was assassinated, and his assassin was actually, believe it or not, even though he was caught right after the shooting in the cafe, was actually found not guilty. And the verdict, the people's verdict, let us say, was only delivered in 1936 when the Spanish anarchist, he went into exile in Spain, the assassin, and he was shot by the anarchists in Spain, Jaurès' assassin. Now, and the final thing I want to say about his lifespan is, so he died in 1914, so he was 40 or 55 years old. So Lord only knows how much longer he could have lived. But just to give an idea, Bergson, his classmate at the École Normale, didn't die till 1941. So he had, he could have had a good long life ahead of him, and the whole course of French socialism and of European history could very well have been different. We can't speculate. Jeff and I, we can talk about this later. I was just being a pain in the ass when I told you the other day. He definitely would have opposed the Bolsheviks. There's no question. But later on, the communists claimed him as their own. But anyway, so there was Jaurès. He believed in democracy, the republic, anti-clericalism, and the revolution. And there we go. So I called him, the original title for this talk was The Last Jacobin. And I think that really sums him up best. Jeff?
Okay, so that's great, Mitch. Thank you for the introduction to Jaurès. So when he's working in this book, 1898 through, you said 1909 or 1908? Like that?
Yeah.
He's a leader in the French socialist movement, a leader in a number of different parties during this period. He's a leader at international congresses. He's closely identified with just the idea of democratic socialism. And he writes this book that is called The Socialist History of the French Revolution. What makes it a socialist history? I mean, what does it mean for a history to be socialist? What makes this history socialist?
Right. So when it's in the beginning of the book, there's many ways of explaining that. So his own definition of the book was that it was going to be a materialist, as in Marx, and was going to be mystical, is in the sense of Michelet, and also he talks about Plutarch. So he wrote it under the auspices. So there's some really important quotes on this.
There's about a triple inspiration.
Right, it's triple. So because
it's funny, right? Because you would expect, if he says Marx, that's not surprising. I'm writing under the inspiration of Marx. No surprise if he's calling it a socialist history. So why is this? What's up with this triple inspiration? Marx, Michelet, Plutarch.
Right, because so in Michelet, it's a history. It's almost history as a novel. It's also a mammoth history, and it's beautifully written, and it's very the character studies are really they're well written. It's beautifully written. All the scenes are really dramatically described the same way Jaurès would do it. And actually, I have to say Michelet does it a little bit better. And but the difference between and then Plutarch is the focusing or the focusing also on the individual, the role of the individual. So Plutarch, you have the good guy and the bad guy. There's always in Plutarch's lives. And so the book is also, Jaurès also has really interesting insights into each individual's history. So the materialism has got to do with the whole flow of the events, the way classes played out in the revolution. Mm-hmm. The Michelet part is like I said, the novelistic aspect of it. The roman fleuve. It's like this is the size of Proust. It's the same size as Remembrance of Things Past. And Plutarch, for looking at people as individuals and judging them, also, I have to say. But the difference also between what makes Jaurès superior to Michelet is that Michelet, his history, great as it is like a Dickens novel. That
doesn't sound so bad,
right? Which is not so bad, but it also got weaknesses. Which is Uriah Heep is always going to be a creep, and so for Michelet, he hated not Danton. He hated Marat. He hated the sans-culottes, and they're evil and wicked no matter what they do. Absolutely, he's unforgiving, and so there's really no growth or any change in the characters in Michelet. If in volume 1 he hates somebody, he's going to hate him at the end. The edition that I have is 4 volumes. He's going to hate him in the same way in volume 4. But Jaurès, his vision is much more well-rounded, and that even characters who he admires, like Robespierre, he's able to understand why people hated him. In that sense, who was it, John? You were talking about, about Serge, and it's like to bring in Serge at every talk. That Serge's most impressive book is Comrade Tulaev, where he actually has good things to say about Stalin. And if you read his notebooks, characters who you think he would absolutely hate, Serge understands the flow of their lives and how everything went together from being good to being rats. And Jaurès also does that.
As you're saying that, Mitch, I'm remembering there's a passage in, I forget which part of your book it's in, but in your abridgment, you've got this one passage that I remember struck me as I read, where you actually have a little bit of sympathy for the king. I mean, not political agreement with the king, but Jaurès sets up, I forget what's going on, but there's a scene where the king is just sort of bewildered by what's going on in front of him. He doesn't understand. And you can have some human sympathy for, of all people, the king.
Right, and that's typical throughout these lengthy volumes, and this is again something you and I were discussing, Jeff, the other day, that all of these books, I mean, it's an obvious thing to say that any of the great historians of the French Revolution or of any event, what's in there, what the book is a mirror of their own personalities and their own viewpoints. And who they are, you could judge them basically by the books. So the weaknesses in Michelet's, Michelet, who was a really decent man who suffered, for his democratic ideas, still, he had his limits to how things would go. But Jaurès, you can see just everything about him comes out in these books. But what comes out the most is just his love of the revolution and his understanding of what it accomplished, what it didn't accomplish, and why it couldn't accomplish everything that it set out to do. But where's the quote? Oh, here we go. It's like I think it's the second sentence of the book. He says, "We want to recount the events that occurred between 1789 and the end of the 19th century from the socialist point of view for the benefit of the common people, workers, and peasants." Okay. And so, on this, I was reluctant to use this quote, to talk about this quote tonight, because I said, I must have made a mistake in translation. I'm not perfect. I'm as close to it as a human being can get. But I said, the 19th century?
Right.
This can't be. So I had to hunt through the book, and I found it. So for him, the French Revolution was... So he was writing this at the end of the 19th century. Right. So the French Revolution never ended.
It was still happening when he.
It was still happening. Everything that was going on in France in 1798 was still the French Revolution.
So the socialists of his generation, that's the French Revolution.
That's the French Revolution.
And Dreyfus, that's the French Revolution.
Exactly. And so it's like a chicken and egg thing. You defend the Republic because you love the Revolution, or you defend the Revolution because you love the Republic.
Well, that's part of what he means by socialist history. But I want to get back. I mean, the sentence you just quoted talked about the workers and peasants,
right,
and common people, which is maybe
common people, right?
Republican than a Marxist idea. But you talked a bunch about Michelet and Plutarch, but you actually didn't say much about Marx's influence. So I do want to ask about that. I mean, it's clear, with the emphasis on individual characters and so forth, right, that this is not what we would expect if our standards of socialist history are set by later generations of Marxist historians, because often in what you think of as a Marxist history, individuals hardly appear. It's all about classes. Depends on the author, but that's
right,
sort of the general pattern. So in what ways is Jaurès history about classes? And
right. Well, it's about class. Like, for example, this is the second volume, but the first volume, actually all the volumes, this volume also, there are huge chunks of the book that are an analysis of the development of the social forces that led to the revolution, that fed into the revolution. So what was the social basis of the beliefs and actions of the Gironde, the moderates? And what was the role? There's very little about the colonies, about Saint-Domingue and Guadeloupe and Martinique. But, it's about the beginnings of capitalism and how that fed into motivating and was the support for, or was supported by, the various factions. Now, one of the things, though, is he makes what I consider to be a mistake, and it's a common one in left-wing histories, is to talk about the proletariat. Okay, because he talks about the proletariat, but there was no
the 1700s.
And there really was no. There was an artisanal class. There were small workshops, but there was not an industrial proletariat in France, right, at the time of the Revolution. And in fact, that carries on. To say that the French Revolution goes on, that it's also a misconception about the Paris Commune. Because the Paris Commune, that in the studies that have been done of the class makeup of various units of the National Guard stuff, There were people who worked in small ateliers, small workshops.
Mm-hmm.
So there was not like these were not factory workers. So when he talks about the proletariat, at the very best, it's a pre-proletariat. And even the left of the revolution, the sans-culottes, they were not proletarians. They were poor people, but they were poor people who worked either for themselves or in small workshops. Nevertheless, there were, the beginning of classes, and there was conflict between capitalism and feudalism. And so in that, even though he was not a big fan of the Communist Manifesto, and he seriously revised Marxism. We were asking about what's Marxist. His Marxism. There'd be many Marxists who would say he wasn't Marxist at all. And Jules Gued, who was to the left of him in the French Socialist movement, thought he was just nothing but what would later be called a social patriot. Mm-hmm. So, it's a tricky question, but he does look at the class forces, which was something that, Michelet, who was really much more concerned with the world of ideas and politics, wasn't as concerned with the class stuff, the economic classes.
Right. So you talked about Jaurès. I think your phrase was his love for the revolution.
Right.
And he's got this great chapter title towards the end of his history, which you include in your book. It's something like "How should we judge the revolutionaries?" or "How do we judge the revolutionaries?"
Right.
What's the answer? According to
so
Jaurès, want to judge the revolutionaries.
Let me find it, because it's a. So there's several quotes. Okay, hang on. Let me just find it. So I'll read. This is from the very, very end of the book, and again, it's exemplary of Jaurès's willingness to cut people slack. Okay. What we must never be forgotten when judging these men is that the problems fate imposed on them were formidable and probably beyond human strength. Perhaps it wasn't possible for one generation alone to bring down the Ancien Regime, create new laws and rights, raise an enlightened and proud people from the depths of ignorance, poverty, and misery, fight against an international league of tyrants and slaves, and to put all passions and forces to use in this combat, while at the same time ensuring the evolution of the fevered, exhausted country towards normal order and well-ordered freedom. The France of the here we go, it goes back to this other idea. The France of the Revolution required a century. Countless trials, backslidings into monarchy, reawakenings of the republic, invasions, dismemberments, coups d'état, and civil wars before it finally arrived at the organization of the republic. So I just want to apologize as I'm reading, because for those who don't know, I'm legally blind, so it's really hard for me to read. So the hesitations there, but not that I become illiterate in my dotage. So, but anyway, so you can see that he refuses to cast judgment on them. That this is something that's absolutely foreign, I have to say, to almost every other left-wing history of the French Revolution. So there's one that it's never been translated into English. It's up there with Jaurès in importance. Is Daniel Guérin's History of the French Revolution, and that's nothing but scolding. At the time he wrote it, Guérin was a Trotskyist. He would later on become a libertarian Marxist, and the whole book is nothing but scolding the Jacobins and Robespierre for not being Lenin and not being Bolsheviks. And viewing things that way would be totally, totally alien to Jaurès, because I guess also because he was such so politically involved that he could see that there's choices that have to be made at every minute, and you never know how any of them would turn out. I mean, let me see if I can find the quote. That there's a great quote about why Robespierre fell, and it has to do with fear. Let me see, it's in one of these here. That it was when Robespierre set up the cult of the supreme being to replace established religion, people were afraid, his fellow Jacobins were afraid, that he was now not only going to be at the head of the state, he was going to be at the head of a religion. And then he would just be an absolute total tyrant. And so, again, I said this before, even though he admires Robespierre, he sees that he made mistakes. That was, whether that really was Robespierre's actual intention or not, but when it was actually, I think it's even in Jaurès, he walked ahead of the other members of the National Assembly. And it's a great touch in the book, that people took that as significant, as signifying that he thought himself better than everybody else because he was walking ahead of everybody else. Mm-hmm. So it shows how people he's supporting is still at the other side of, and he's able to pick up on these tiny little details or seemingly insignificant details and construct the story around them, the history of it. But basically it was, you can't judge them. And in fact, he has, when he talks about the revolution devouring its young, let me find that. You have any question you want to ask while I'm running roughshod over here?
No, it's funny passage. I've got a question, but go ahead.
Let's hear.
There's somewhere where he says, I'm not going to be able to find it right now, but he says something like, we shouldn't judge the revolutionaries the way we would by looking for the people in the past who most closely anticipate our own views. We should look for the people who advanced democracy, who advanced the republic, something like that. And that makes him broadly sympathetic to Robespierre in some ways, but he's also really critical of Robespierre. And I guess I wanted to push you to talk a little bit about that too. You called Jaurès the last Jacobin.
Right.
A lot of criticisms of the Jacobins.
But that's all right, because the Jacobins were a much bigger tent than people think. So I mean, they're like the pure Robespierrists. I mean, there was the Society of Robespierrist Studies. I think it even still exists. And there were historians who, it didn't matter what Robespierre did, he was right.
Right.
And he was right. He was right because anything Robespierre did was right. And so, just by definition, everything he did was right. But he's not. Again, Jaurès is looking at the bigger picture, and I'm trying to find the quotes about the revolution devouring its young, because what he says there is that was going to happen. That it was just in the natural course of things, and had they not killed each other, it's almost a comical viewpoint. He said, had they not, killed each other over the course of the terror, or even before the terror, then Bonaparte would have killed them all. So they were all, dead men on leave from the beginning, and they knew it. Every one of them knew that death was a distinct possibility. So, but it's his willingness to step outside any, fixed way of viewing the events. I mean, to say that that's what happens when there's disputes, and it's really matters of life and death for the nation. It's unfortunate this happens because he was, he hated any form of cruelty. I mean, I have to find the quotes. Right. So, for example, he has this beautiful passage, really poetic. O leaders of today, think on these words and make sure your laws and morality are as humane as possible so that you will benefit from this on the inevitable day of revolution. Proletarians, now this is words that many 20th century revolutions and revolutionaries should have remembered. Proletarians, remember that cruelty is a holdover from servitude, for it attests to the fact that the barbarism of the oppressive regime is still present in you. Remember that in 1789, when the working class crowd momentarily surrendered itself to the cruel and murderous intoxication, that it was the first communist, the first of the proletariat's great emancipators, Babeuf, who had a heavy heart. And in fact, Babeuf celebrated the downfall of Robespierre. Babeuf, who was the first communist, and who would himself, go to the guillotine in 1795. So, he was always looking for, even in negative events of the revolution, a way to show that was the wrong way. So the revolution was an example of what should be done, what shouldn't be done also.
And so he's looking for lessons, right? When he said that he's writing a socialist history, part of the point is that he wants to write the history of the revolution in a way that has evident lessons for socialists at the beginning of the 20th century. What are those lessons? What does he think a socialist reading about the French Revolution in 1900 or 1910 should learn about how power works, how you organize a movement, what you do, what you don't do?
Right. So this, again, it leads to another essential part of his principles, his guiding principles. And this one is another really essential one. Okay. Now, first of all, I want to preface this by saying that he also wrote, in an important sense, we are the party of democracy in the revolution, but we haven't shackled and frozen it. We don't claim to have fixed human society in the economic and social formulae that prevailed between 1789 and 1795, and which responded to living in economic conditions that are no more. So the first thing is, any lesson that's to be learned has to be taken. You have to take the context into account. So just because the Jacobins did something, or the Robespierre did something, Babeuf or whoever, doesn't mean that it's what we have to do, because we're not living in 1789. Right. But here was the one, and this is what for him as a socialist, and not so much of a revolutionary, but certainly as a radical said. A society takes on a new form only when the immense majority of the individuals who compose it demand or accept a great change. This is self-evident in the case of the Revolution of 1789. It broke out and succeeded only because an immense majority, one might say the entire country, wanted it. And he went further. If it's true that the revolution had to have resort to force, the 14th of July and the 10th of August marked the fall of the Bastille and the taking of the Tuileries. But, and this is a point that should be carefully noted, force was never employed to impose on the nation the will of a minority.
Right.
So this is, for Jaurès, the great lesson that can be applied almost directly, that the revolution succeeded insofar as it did, because this was not, let's just go to 1795 and the conspiracy of the equals, which is crushed pretty quickly, and that's the end of communism until Babeuf decades later. Blanqui decades later. That the revolution was able to completely overturn French society. And we have to remember that it did away with the monarchy, killed the king, for God's sake, that it took over church lands, it took over individual property, it dispossessed the aristocracy. None of that stuff was done because a handful of people in Paris decided on it. It was done because the entire people was behind the revolution, and they were so the government was able to push things that far. So there's where the revolution was really the basis for Jaurès' politics as a socialist, up until the day he died.
As a socialist, but I mean, look, I'm thinking about the things you've listed here. So he wants a majoritarian political movement. He wants to generally avoid the resort to force.
Right.
He imagines revolution as a process that happens gradually over generations. I mean, this is a reformist interpretation of the revolution, isn't it?
Yes and no, because a reformist would have said, well, you have to sit by and wait for the people to vote for this stuff, and they weren't going to be voting for it. I mean, it was still it was the people carrying the events forward, and the way he viewed socialism is it was a gradual process, socialism, that one day it would start by nationalizing a few things and then a few other things, and then one day you'd wake up and you were living. It really was literally what he said. And then one day we'll be living under socialism. But I want to find what he had to say about, hang on, the taking over of church property, because people said that it was the constitutional clergy. So what happened was, instead of just shutting down all the churches and arresting all the priests, if priests would swear loyalty to the Republic, then they were okay. He was trying to establish Robespierre. Right. He was trying to establish the cult of reason and all that. Notre Dame became the temple of reason, and Jaurès defended that, even though the people said they should have gone further and just shut down all the churches, and stripped all the priests, even the ones who would swear loyalty to the Republic, stripped them all of their functions. But for Jaurès, it was a step on the way to that. So his end goal was not to reform the aristocracy. It was not to reform socialism, or the way he viewed the revolution. That it went as far as it could. And now it's because the revolution didn't end with Napoleon rising to power, it was still going on. And so it was up to Jaurès, it's up to the socialists, up to the working class of late 19th, early 20th century France to complete the work of the revolution, which was socialism.
It's sort of like he's plotting the trajectory.
Exactly.
And it's not that the revolutionaries didn't get to this point, it's that they were... The important thing isn't which point they got to, it's which direction they were seeming to
Exactly. They started, nothing could have been started without them. And if you compare other revolutions of the time, like the American Revolution, which, however important it was in establishing democracy and a republic in a wide area, didn't really change property relations very much at all. And whereas the French Revolution went right after that, almost immediately, and that is a step on the way to socialism. That they didn't get bogged down, even though they've had many, many, many constitutions. That they never got bogged down in, we can't do this because property is sacrosanct. Everything is for the good of the people, and they just did what they had to do.
So I've got a couple more questions for you before we open up to general conversation, Mitch. I'm thinking about the thing you said a few moments ago. You quoted the part where Jaurès talks about not trying to imitate what the revolutionaries did in 1790, whatever. So it would not be fair to say, I'm not going to print up a T-shirt that says, "What would Jaurès do?" Because that would be kind of time machine question that doesn't help us. But still, I mean, we're reading this stuff now in the 2020s, and it would not be honest if we were to say we're not looking for lessons here. We want to learn something from this, just like Jaurès in 1900 is reading about the 1790s because he wants to take some kind of lessons from it. So what do you think is the legacy of this book today?
Okay,
of this book, Jaurès.
Yeah, that it's like I said before, that what it is it's that even though it's not just a methodological question, that it's a moral question, and that Jaurès, as a person, as a political figure, as a historian, was just a really terrific human being, and one whose spirit, he's the kind of person that should be an inspiration to progress. His decency, his humanity, and I asked you to read the quote for me. My wife's sitting here now; maybe she can read it here.
Tell me where.
Is what I thought was that Jaurès was the personification of what the best definition that I thought that I've ever read in any of the too many books I've read, left-wing books I've read over the course of the last half century. And that's what Orwell had to say in The Road to Wigan Pier.
Oh.
Okay? And what he said was, socialism means justice and common decency.
Yeah, justice and common decency.
And that's the example, and that's what can be learned from this instead of from Guérin's book, which unless you read French you can't read, but even books like Kropotkin's history, which is an anarchist history, or Soboul, who's a communist history, or Mathieu's, both communist histories, or Lefebvre. But what you can learn from Jaurès, from reading his book, from his life, from his writings, you can find a whole bunch of his writings on the Marxist Internet Archive, is what you could just find is justice and common decency. These were the threads that ran through his life and through everything in his works. So that's the lesson. Because the question of what can we learn, it always comes up when I've done events at MEP. But I have to be honest and say there's not much we could learn from most of these events, historical events, because as Jaurès said, events occur in a given context. And to be inspired by the copper miners of Bisbee in 1917 is a wonderful thing, but it makes no sense in a country where there are no copper miners or only a few, and where all of the coal miners in the country, if they were in the Rose Bowl, there'd still be 30,000 empty seats. So, the lessons that we could learn from Jaurès are really much bigger ones. It's how to comport ourselves, how to conduct our actions, and what actions we should engage in and what we should hope for from them. So I think I answered the question. There we go.
Lovely. I have one other question, but I'll just save it to see if there's an opportune time later, because I think others have things they want to ask. So I'm going to ask, if you know how to raise your Zoom hand, do, but if your camera is on, you can also just raise your actual living hand. And I'll try to call on people in the order that I see them. I'm going to ask you to keep your questions, in the form of a question and relatively succinct so that we can have an extended conversation. Who wants to start?
I've said it all.
Yeah. David.
There we go.
Who can unmute himself, I think.
Yeah. Okay, Mitch. I was very. Thank you very much. I was very interested in, especially your last few remarks. So let me tackle this question about evolutionary socialism, because also I think it's an important way of thinking about social change in general. But so let's take the French Revolution. The king was forced to call the Estates General into meeting, and at the Estates General, the question arose as how are we going to vote? The old way, which is each of the three estates, the aristocracy, the clergy, and the commoners, if you will. I don't know what they called them back in France then, but each estate voted separately, and then they each had one vote. So of course the commoners said, well, that's not fair because there are two of you representing 5% of the population, and then there are the rest of us representing 95% of the population. So that led to them breaking off and forming what became the National Assembly. Well, the king might have been willing to go along with that, being not a strong statesman anyway, but his family and his supporters absolutely were prepared to, they were prepared to go in and kill all of them rather than submit to that. So then the question is, does that mean should people just back down and say, oh yeah, you're unhappy, so yeah, let's not do anything? Well, they didn't do that, and then there was violence. So it's the same issue with socialism. It's fine to say we can nationalize this thing and nationalize that thing and set up this, universal health care or whatever kind of things we set up. But when you see that the that the capitalist class is willing to use any kind of violence or trickery or fraud in order to defeat that, then assuming you have a mass of people that want to support these things, it does seem that, there's no way to avoid some kind of violence. So we either end up with the Simon Schama view, which is the whole thing was a big mistake and they should have just said, oh, okay, sorry, King, we'll go a little slower here, da-da-da-da. Or what I think is Jaurès' view, which is that people were justified in resisting this.
Well, right, because people were pushed into it by the situation. I mean, I can find a quote about the killings in the September massacres, which actually is kind of like not exactly what you were talking about, David. But in the September massacres there were rumors rife in Paris that the royalists were about to take over the city, and they were being helped by the people in 1792, and they were being helped by the prisoners, all the royalist prisoners that were in jail. And so what do the people do? They slaughter, hundreds, if not thousands of people, based on rumors.
A horrible episode, yeah.
Right, and this is, and it's when I said about cruelty. This was like a cruel act that flowed out of just
fear.
Fear, out of fear. It wasn't the Great Fear, but the Great Fear also was very early in the Revolution also. But Jaurès doesn't say don't do anything. But also remember he also said you have to look at the circumstances, and that if you want to make a lasting change, which the French Revolution did. He says, as like what I read from, that it was basically wasn't the majority; it was basically the entire nation that backed it, and it did. And when you don't have the support of the entire nation, well, then you have a situation, and I'll risk saying it, like the Soviet Union, which he would have absolutely abhorred. He absolutely would have hated it. It's hard, you can't say what somebody would have done, but just that quote about if you don't have like the full country behind you, he would not have been a big fan of that. Whether he would have supported Kerensky, who knows? And he might have even supported the Bolsheviks at the very beginning when it looked like they did have everybody's support. But, he had confidence that because the Republic, that if the Republic equals socialism, ultimately the Republic is going to turn socialist. And because the people are going to see the wisdom of it. He had enormous faith and belief in the people. And that, the people who made the revolution were the French people. I mean, I didn't get a chance, it was from another talk that I have all these quotes about his love and belief of the French mission. That France wasn't just the country of the revolution. France was something special in humanity. And it had a historic mission to fulfill, and it had to do anything to defend it. So there's really no contradiction. There are moments where, the people need to take matters in their own hands and be violent, but they have to, bear in mind to be humane about it. And I think.
Fred Murphy, I think, was next with the question.
Yeah, I wonder if Mitch or you or Geoff would care to compare Jaurès' history with Trotsky's history of the Russian Revolution, which don't compare Jaurès' and Trotsky's politics so much as the work of a historian and the nature of the work. And of course, Trotsky's has the advantage for Trotsky is that it ends in November 1917, and he doesn't have to address a lot of things that went on after that, at least in that history. Of course, he does elsewhere. But just as a literary work by a Marxist scholar and active socialist, how do these two works compare?
You want to talk, Geoff, or
no? This is for you, Mitch.
Okay. Well, it was in my original talk on this, I did compare the two mainly in the fact that Jaurès, he wrote this, as I said, while he was defending Dreyfus, writing books on Dreyfus, defending his position in the Socialist International. He wrote a 500-page book on how to reorganize the French army.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, in a way, actually, Trotsky would have approved. He believed that it had to be a people's army, and only the people in arms could save the republic. So, and whereas Trotsky was under forced, it was forced leisure for Trotsky when he was writing that. So just like the circumstances under which it's written are completely different. And of course, both of they're both beautifully written. Trotsky was a fabulous writer. Jaurès, a little bit ornate. I mean, it was a tough book to translate, I have to say, because his written style was very much like his speaking style. So he was a late 19th, early 20th century orator, and flowery phrases and stuff, and it wasn't easy. Trotsky didn't write that way. Trotsky was a really good writer, but both of them wrote the book that justified themselves, that justified their positions, and they shall go nameless. Those who showed up at past talks on this, who whipped out their copy of Trotsky to counter what the stuff that the Jaurès said. So, you choose your poison or your wine or whatever. I mean, they're both terrific books. They're both written. Trotsky's is written obviously from the inside, defending his own position, whereas Jaurès has much more freedom. So he can say bad things about Robespierre. He can say bad things about people who, because he didn't know them. He was able to judge them from the distance of a century, whereas Trotsky had, his own axes to grind on these issues. Which is, I'm not downplaying how important the book is, but I'll take Jaurès any day. And both died assassinated. And both their assassins managed to live out their, well, actually, Vaillant was killed, but Ramon Mercader lived out his days in Cuba after being in jail. The man who loved dogs.
Thank you.
John, was that a hand rising?
I was just repeating The Man Who Loved Dogs.
Oh.
So I'm sorry about that.
Right. It's a book that everyone should read. Umberto Padilla, not Padilla.
Mitch, when we were talking the other day, you asked me to remind you tonight about the idea of internal paradigms. You wanted to say something about internal paradigms. I'm reminded.
Well, it actually goes to what Fred's question just does. Just did. And so what it is there's a fabulous French thinker who's only had a couple of books translated into English, Pierre Bayard. And he's written books. His books that have been translated into English are How to Talk About Books You've Never Read, How to Talk About Places You've Never Been. He wrote about who killed Roger Ackroyd. So and a book on the Hound of the Baskervilles, where he proves that the authors of mystery books gave their own solution, that the killers weren't really the killers. But he has a great book on Hamlet, in which he talks about different interpretations of Hamlet. And what he points out is when no two people, and it's really his underlying thing in like How to Talk About Books You've Never Read, is no two people read the same book. Because we all go into whatever we're reading with a certain internal or inner paradigm. And so when I bring to a book, because of my personality, because of my upbringing, because of everything, it's not the same thing that Geoff is bringing to a book. Mm-hmm. And so what you're going to notice and what you're going to focus on and what you're going to see as the basis for what that book is completely different for any two people. And Hamlet is perfect because what Bayard talks about in his book on Hamlet is that he discusses all the different psychoanalytic theories about Hamlet. And he points out that of the dozens of psychoanalysts, psychiatrists who've written about Hamlet, they all have different interpretations, and none of them quote the same passages. which shows that you're not really reading the same book, because once you go in with an idea, you're focusing on different things. And this happens with every, it's a deformation that all historians have to confront, that you go into studying an event and you go into it with a certain mindset that's constructed out of so many things. It's not just your class background. It's not just your politics. It's your personality. It's how your general worldview, how you view people. You're always going to look for what it is. So that's why Jaurès, that if you draw a picture of Jaurès from this, you get Jaurès. It would be, an accurate, I think, it would be a perfectly accurate portrait of Jaurès. And when I've read what contemporaries wrote about him, and he was exactly what, the conclusion that I've drawn from this book and from reading about his life. And, other historians, it's going to be the same thing. So, Trotsky, when he talks about the Russian Revolution, he's going to be Trotsky with his personality and with his, I'm always right. And that's all there is to it. And there's never any hesitation about it. And especially if he's right, if he's wrong. And, but other people, when they write about the revolution, like I said, Michelet, his history is beautiful, but it's the work of a comfortable middle-class academic, fabulous writer. And so he sees people as those kind of characters. The people he would like to be with are the people that are going to come off looking good. So that's, it's a really fruitful way of viewing things. And, it's like, even if I don't know, just to use myself as an example, that if it's a negative article about anything, I know that it was either written by me or somebody like me. So, because it's just, it's my nature. And, like I told you, Geoff, if I were to go through articles on Public Seminar, I would know what you wrote.
Yeah.
Because I know you.
Yeah, you would.
We are who we are.
Speaking of who Jaurès was, somebody, I think it must have been David, asked a question in the chat, a historical question. And I can try to answer that. It's the question, for those of you who can't see the chat. The question was about the circumstances of Jaurès' murder. If he was prepared to support a war with Germany, why would a nationalist kill him? So, Mitch, you'll probably want to add to what I say, but just to address it briefly. It's true. What Mitch was emphasizing was Jaurès' support of defensive war. In the event that an aggressive war happened. But what he was known for in 1914 was being what we would call an anti-war activist. From, I guess, probably around 1912, when rumors of war begin increasing, it begins to look like there's going to be a war. He's giving speeches across France and elsewhere in Europe, arguing against a war, saying war would be a disaster. We should do anything we can to stop a war from happening. He's not in the cabinet or at the time, but he has friends who are in high office, and he's using all the back channels he has to push for strenuous diplomacy. So he's seen as rightly seen as someone who's not eager for war. He will, in the event of an aggressive war against France, he will not oppose France's self-defense, but he's an anti-warrior.
Right.
He's not a pacifist, but he's not eager for war. He's never chauvinistic against Germany. Far from it. There's this moment in the parliamentary debates in, I guess it must have been 1914, when Germany has just made some announcement about its new level of military readiness, and Jaurès sends out for a better French-German dictionary to see if he can find a way of interpreting the German announcement that gives more room for future diplomatic efforts with Germany, that doesn't preclude the possibility of peace. So he's always, maybe with excessive optimism, and it's easy to say that with hindsight, looking for a way to forestall a war. So that's why a nationalist killed him, because the nationalist position was we should be eager for war with Germany.
And also that what was going to stop war, because Jeff's 100% right in everything he said, what's going to stop war are the workers.
Right.
And what's going to happen, so I have a quote here, and who knows if the workers of Europe, finally exasperated by these periodic crises of hypocrisy, barbaric envy, and ferocious stupidity, won't cry out that enough is enough, that an end must be put to this monarchical and bourgeois Europe.
Yeah.
So it was...
Right. International working class solidarity.
And that was, like I said, it was what he was organizing. If you go to the pages of L'Humanité in the days running up to the war, everything is about the conference, the peace conference he's trying to organize amongst socialists. But it's clear that that whoever's the aggressor, the nation that's being aggressed should defend itself, and it's everything. All of his writings in the last few years, from 1912 on for sure, were about how Germany and Austria-Hungary were out of control, and they were the threats. And like I said, they have to defend the Republic against. So if Germany wins, what happens is France then falls under the heel of the Kaiser. So certainly nobody can consider that a progressive moment. So he's like weighing all these elements. Lenin, on the other hand, well, it's hard to defend the Tsar, whereas you could defend the Clemenceau.
Folks have other questions? Feel free to ask them out loud or in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to ask out loud, you have to unmute yourselves.
Yeah, just ask, recognize, raise your hand, or literal or figurative if you want to be unmuted.
I'll ask a question. Am I coming through?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm Miguel, by the way. Thank you for sharing this time with us. You mentioned that he talks very little of France's colonies.
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us what he actually says, or?
Well, actually, I don't remember, because it really was not.
It's that little, huh?
He does talk about it, but no, because the revolution in Saint-Domingue took place during this period. It started during this period. But no, it's mainly got to do with the way certain parts of France profited by and were, it was the motor for their economies. But the colonial struggle was not, his focus here. I mean, he did write a book, in his own lifetime about Morocco and the colonies. But he's not very far, and this is something that I can't find it here, but I'm almost positive I translated something. It wasn't like the civilizing mission, but given his belief that France is like got a providential mission, it's not far from him to fall into that there's something positive that can come out of the French colonial project,
right. Like Marx in a sense.
Yeah, right. I mean, I'm glad that you said that, Miguel, because it's very because it's really easy for us to condemn people for positions that nobody would take in what year are we? Because I'm getting old, I'm forgetting. 2022, right?
Yeah.
These were the racism and anti-Semitism in Marx and Engels' correspondence is really horrifying.
Jumps off the page, yeah.
Yeah. So, and Jaurès actually was attacked, during the Dreyfus affair, because the far left in France was really anti-Semitic at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was attacked. I mean, so I have the quote in here somewhere, essentially he's like an agent of the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
So, it was, but because I have to be honest. this is like thousands and thousands of pages. I didn't go through every page as closely as perhaps I should. But
Okay.
and I have to take the criticism because it would have been something worthwhile, exploring in this. But
Next time.
Thanks.
next time.
Thanks.
For volume 2, maybe.
Yeah, it took 8 years for this for the paperback to come out. So. Anybody else?
Yeah, and I did misspeak before. You are able to unmute yourselves. I didn't realize that, as Miguel figured out. Different Zoom meetings are set up different ways. It's confusing.
I'd like to ask a question about the task of the translator or how that works, because one of the things that's really interesting about this, or at least I find it, and you mentioned it and everybody can see it, is how much of the person seems to come through. Somehow you get the feeling that you know this man, this Jaurès, and you like him. You want to have him over for dinner or something like that. But it comes through in a way that's very sympathetic. But it not only comes through from him to the page, but it comes through this translation. Something of that, whatever it is that the words create, comes through so that reading this translation, you get the same feeling. That you're getting to know a person. And that just seems like a really difficult thing to pull off in the act of translating.
Well, I appreciate that, John. And it's funny. So I published. I'm not quite sure, but I counted a couple days ago. So I published, I think, 15 books, and all of them are by people who I admire and respect in one way or another. And it's because one book is by somebody who I hated the person, hated what they had to say, and it's a dreadful book. It's an absolutely horrible book. It's an embarrassment to me. But it's because I didn't like the person. And so, like, for me, it is a way. I mean, you got it exactly right. When I'm doing translations, it's my way of, like, channeling the person, but also expressing every translation that I've done. And I've done, like, so many counts that it's over 1,000 translations on the Marxist Internet Archive. And all of them were acts of homage. And so, you really want to get it right. And it really is so much easier to translate somebody who you admire and respect, because you really want to get it right. And this, I have to say, like I said at the beginning, this is a really tough book to translate, and it was so tough that I had almost everything that's in the book was on the Marxist Internet Archive at one point. And when I went back to look at them, and I sent them in as samples so that I could get the Pluto to publish it, to give me the green light for this, and they were terrible. They were absolutely awful. And so I had to, like, rework all of them, and I won't say that I got into Jaurès' skin, but, I took the time to, like, learn more about him and to get a better feel for him, and it works that way. That it's one of the fun things. I mean, I've stopped translating. It's behind me. It's done. I'm not doing any more of it. But it was always, translation for me is a way of putting on assuming different guises, and putting myself in different historical situations. So I've done a ton of translations of the Argentine, the Peronist left in the 1970s and 80s, the Montoneros, the armed all the armed Peronist groups, because being of Russian Jewish heritage, my family, some of it could have gone to Argentina. So I could have been, had the family moved to Buenos Aires and not New York, I could have been a Montonero. And doing the Montonero translations was a way for me to see what would Marcelo Abidor have been like. And it really does work that way. When I've done translations of resistance fighters, it's like, okay, if I would have been like an 18-year-old in France, this would have been me, shooting Nazis on the street. Now, if I could, use this to talk about Pierre Bayard again, he wrote a great book called "Would I Have Been a Resistance Fighter or an Executioner?" And he tried to put himself in the position of what would have happened if he would have been 18 years old when the Germans occupied Paris. And his father had been in the resistance. So he followed every step of his father's life to see what would he have done that took his father into the resistance. And he said, what would I have done in this situation? And by the third step, he says, there's absolutely no fucking way I would have been in the resistance. I like to stay home and read books. And there's no reason to believe I would have been any different. And, I am who I am, and it's all what I am. So heroism ain't for me. And then at the end of the book, he admits he really does like to look good in front of women. So if he would have fallen in love with a woman who would have looked up to him, then maybe he would have joined the resistance. But anyway, I don't know if other translators, I doubt if other translators view things this way, but I have the privileged position of only translating what I want. Mm-hmm. And because I used to have the act, everything would go on Marxist.org, and there've been publishers who just wanted my books on stuff that I like, books on anarchist bomb throwers. Because there's a perfect example. My book on anarchist bomb throwers, it was you live in America and you fucking hate the place. So what be more admirable than writing about people who threw bombs and blew up, the Chamber of Deputies? Rather than do it myself, I could just translate it.
The risks.
It's the lazy man's way of being a revolutionary. And since I'm fundamentally a lazy human being, what the hell?
I'm not convinced by the laziness, but I'm going to ask you a couple more questions.
Okay, go ahead.
Arguing with you on that. A couple of people have asked questions in the chat. Jacqueline or Jacqueline?
Right, Jacqueline. Right? Hey, Jacqueline.
We can make it French for the occasion. Asked, the 19th century literary style fascinates me. How did you prepare yourself to understand that different style?
It's glaringly obvious, because I've read a lot of, by the time I did Jaurès, I'd already translated tons and tons and tons of 19th century French stuff, revolutionary stuff. And so I knew pretty much what the style is, and I knew about French oratory. It's one of my specialties is French oratorical styles. Right. So I knew that how Jaurès fit into that, and I knew that when I'd gone over the original translations, that I hadn't captured that, that I just made it clunky. Mm-hmm. So I just junked what I had done, and from what I knew of how Frenchmen speak, if you read speeches from the time of the French Revolution, also, I have books of speeches by Robespierre and Saint-Just and everyone. So you learn their oratorical style, and then it's just a matter of just trying to make it. It doesn't always fit in English because it's not necessarily our style. But so that was really what it was, Jacqueline. It was just familiarity with 18th and 19th century French oratory and literature.
And David asked also a translation and abridgment related question. How do you decide which parts of Jaurès' history to leave out? I was going to ask the same thing because I imagine.
Yeah, I kind of alluded to this at the beginning. I could only think. I don't know if the book's 100,000 words. I doubt it. Pluto not only pays poorly, but it makes sure that the book it costs them as little as possible. And so between 75 and 100,000 words is all they're going to give. So I decided to just take the big events of the revolution, and there was it took up enough that it was like when Miguel asked about colonial, about the treatment of the colonies, and there's almost nothing in my book in the treatment of the French economy at the time, because I want the book to have that it's just most people are going to be wanting to know about the Bastille and massacres and the execution of the king and the capture of the king and the execution of the king, and so you just go for the big. It's a greatest hits. It's really not an abridgment. It's not an abridgment. It was a wonderful British historian of the French Revolution said that it's really selections, because you can't abridge, thousands of words to, I don't know, 180, 200 pages. That's not an abridgment. It's really a greatest hit. So I had to leave out, stuff that I might have wanted to put in, but Pluto wasn't budging, and that was it. So, as my wife said, somebody said volume 2, but there won't be one.
And just the sheer amount that Jaurès wrote is kind of astounding. I mean, I remember one of his biographers, I can't remember who, estimates that his collected works, if they were ever published, would be something like 80 or 90 big fat volumes. I mean, it's just, and he's in parliament or a party leader. I mean, I just don't understand how he did this. Do you have any insight in this? Like how?
No, but there is something, and this is a little bit, it spins off from Jacqueline's question, is that like many 19th century French books, but not just French, huge chunks of this are just sections of other books. And, the original, so, there'll be pages
large
and
quotations,
pages,
like big
quotations.
Big block quotations.
Big chunks of, I mean, it wasn't like he was padding his term paper.
Right.
But, the original edition, not this one, but the original edition, was it David was talking about it, the long, big skinny volumes, those have no footnotes. That has absolutely no footnotes. So when this edition came out, somebody had to go back and find all of these quotes. But, people, and that's, it's, in a way, it's kind of like the French Revolution, that I found, or I computed it myself, I'm not sure where I got it, what the day was like for a French revolutionary. Okay? So they had this 2 sessions, say at the National Assembly, every day. And then at night, late at night, they had club meetings, the Jacobins, the Cordeliers, whichever club it was. And that went on until, way late into the night. But while they were doing that, they were also publishing newspapers that they wrote, like the Marat with the L'Ami du Peuple. He wrote the whole newspaper himself. So he was sitting in the National Assembly, attending club meetings, and writing an entire newspaper, all while sitting in his bathtub. So, it was that kind of tirelessness, dedication to the cause, right? I don't know if Jaurès ever slept until the day that Vaillant killed him.
Yeah.
So, yeah. No one else?
More questions?
This is Jacqueline.
Hi, Jacqueline.
Hi, Mitch. This has been very interesting, and I'm going to have an off-the-wall question. Okay, is you spoke about the literary style. All right. So if someone like Baudelaire was, published his, Flowers of Evil, how much was that, like, in, say, Jaurès's, did it challenge Jaurès's literary style, or was it a part of that whole kind of floweriness? Because I've never really been able to get into Baudelaire, and my ex-husband adored him. And it was one of those things that just marked me as a hick kid from the country, that I couldn't get into Baudelaire.
Well, because I don't know. I mean, I don't know that if he was I don't know that he would have liked Baudelaire, because he was pretty much a reactionary. But it was just in the air. It was how you wrote. It really was just the dominant. The dominant style, but especially, in Jaurès's case, in oratory, so like I said, he carries over, his main life is speaking in front of socialist crowds,
right?
Crowds of workers. And so he's naturally going to fall into that style. And I want to tell a great, for those of you who are fans of literature, in Proust's Complete Letters, there's a letter about him going to see Jaurès speak during during the Dreyfus affair. And if there's anything that's hard to imagine, it's Proust sitting at a socialist rally in defense of Dreyfus with Jaurès speaking. But, so sometimes, worlds collide. But it really, it's in his case, I mean, I don't know that I haven't read anything about, which were his favorite writers. We can imagine he would have loved Balzac. But the ornateness is really a carryover from his speechifying.
Okay. I just find it I just find it interesting because I think one of the problems with left speaking now is that it's not very inspirational, and we've lost that tradition of public oratory. And I for one, love really inspirational speeches, and talking now is very dull.
So get in your Wayback Machine, you with Sherman and Peabody, and if you could get yourself back to, Paris in 1905, and then quick learn French, you love it. You'll love it.
I like the Levelers. I mean, I'd go even farther back. I like the Levelers.
Once you're in the Wayback Machine, you can go wherever you want.
But this is great. Thank you very much, Mitch.
Thank you, Jackie. And
really
I haven't gone back to Balestrini. I will. No more questions?
Sorry, Jacqueline, you're muted again.
I just find it very interesting that Jaurès had such a commitment to the French people and their potential for change. I find that extremely inspirational and something to think about. We don't have that kind of confidence anymore.
Mitch, you're muted.
My wife must have snuck it. But this was also a time. This was in the years after the Commune, and the working class movement had been obliterated after the Commune, which was why there were the anarchist bomb throwers, because there were no mass organizations. But this is also the period of the beginning. Jaurès's heyday was the beginning of like mass working class parties and movements, and unions, the CGT, the various socialist parties uniting in one. So there was every reason, for him to view present in the France of that time as the heirs of the revolution. There was the working class was. There was no way of knowing what was going to happen 130 years later, where it would just fall into like a nest of, a horrible cesspool of supporting the National Front and conspiracy theories and all kinds of horrible stuff. Jaurès never would have imagined stuff like that. He never would have been somebody like a Mélenchon, who excused, at the beginning, Russia's actions leading up to the war, who was opposed to vaccines. I mean, just awful stuff. Jaurès never would have, again, it's like the fundamental decency of Jaurès would have been offended. But who knows, had he been around, maybe things wouldn't have turned so ugly. But we'll never know. He would have been 150.
Which is a lot to ask of anybody.
Yeah, he was hardworking, so you never know. He was persistent.
We've got a little time, so folks should feel free to ask another question.
By the way, Fred, I see your comment here about public oratory. If I can find it, I was asked to write an article about the oratory of Saint-Just, the oratorical style of Saint-Just and of the revolutionary orators. If I find it, I'll send it to you.
Yeah, I wasn't joking when I told Michael that at all. I mean, I remember certainly from the time of the 60s and early 70s that there were plenty of really great public speakers on the left but they in turn had learned from people who had been involved in the movements of the 30s and in the civil rights movement and so on. So that the continuity has been largely been lost, and it's hard to find somebody that can really get up before an audience and inspire and
because
at the same time.
Right, and because everybody
We're
just
all on social media. We're all sitting here on Zoom instead of.
Right. It sounds like another one of the chicken and egg problems, right?
It certainly is, yeah.
Unless you've got
Naomi Klein can do it. Naomi Klein can do it.
But nothing. There's been nothing to equal. I still love to listen to Mario Savio's speech. We're all old here, I think. So we all remember Mario Savio's speech. But, after we're done, look it up. It's still just an amazing, amazing, amazing speech.
Jeff is not old.
I don't remember.
Oh, yeah, Jeff's not old. You know Mario Savio's speech? Look it up. Look it up. I'm sorry.
Well, yes,
I was going to say Mario Savio.
But Jeff, you're the one wearing a suit and tie. So.
I know.
But
Still at the office.
The different kinds of oratory and what it led to, and how it inspired people to do things that they might not ordinarily have done.
I heard Mario at Berkeley, and Stokely Carmichael came through twice. Once, both before and after his turn, sort of. And boy, were they incredible speakers. Just you never knew where they got it or how they got it, but boy, they were good.
Rap Brown. I mean, these were like really great speakers.
Yeah.
Now we're getting nostalgic. Let me talk about William Z. Foster.
I worked with a man who remembered William Z. Foster.
There you go.
I worked with real old timers, but
There you go.
those Bay Area Typographical Union meetings got really, really heated.
Mark it down. William Z. Foster actually got spoken about in a talk about the French Revolution. I like to bring him in.
Mitch, that reminds me of another question I wanted to ask. You were talking about taking from Jaurès his spirit, this common decency and commitment to justice. So who are some later, between his time and ours, some later left leaders who you think exhibit at least something similar to that spirit? Who's more or less a Jaurèsian in style? Or
Allende. Salvador Allende.
Why?
Because he actually carried out much of a really Jaurèsian program. Mm-hmm. And, there's a biography of Allende that was published by Pluto that's really interesting. And it's a worthwhile read for the people should look it up. It's in the Revolutionary Lives series. But Allende, just like Jaurès, believed that Chilean democracy could be used to lead to socialism. And he had faith in, misplaced faith, it turned out, in the military. The military was invited into his government twice. They even ran the Ministry of the Interior. But he believed absolutely in democracy. He was opposed. So there was, to the left of him, there was Mir, the left revolutionary movement, and they wanted arms distributed to the working class. And Allende said no, that, we're going to win this. We're going to build, a Chilean road to socialism without killing people, without death, without bloodshed. And so he was, you read his life, it's just a remarkable, it's remarkably Jaurèsian. Up until, he ends up committing suicide and not being assassinated, but he might as well have been assassinated. But he, through everything, he believed in defending democracy. And he thought, that democracy would stand up, that the army would be loyal to its traditions of defending the Chilean Republic. So Allende, I think, is the only figure after Jaurès who I really find admirable. And in this biography, it's got a fact that I didn't know about, which was that we know that when he was in the Moneda and he had his armed guards around him, and he told them all to leave, with him at his final moments were two of his daughters, he had three, and his mistress. So while he was calling his wife, so it's a different world. But Allende is a figure who next year will be the 50th anniversary of the coup on September 11th, 73, and I hope that people are going to remember it and him, because he certainly deserves it.
Sounds like the makings of another talk.
Another talk, right? I'll read all of Allende between now and then. You there, Jeff? Because we got John right on the screen.
Yeah. We're witnesses. You just made a promise, I think.
Oh, who is that? Oh, thank you, Stuart.
So I would say we've got time for some more questions, if anybody has any. I do have one last question for Mitch, but I'll wait and see if we've got I don't want to preclude somebody else from asking. Going once.
That's all right. That's it, Jeff. You're the last question.
Okay, Mitch, aside from the passages you already read us, do you have any other favorite passages in this book that you want to read for us or describe for us?
No.
No, you already hit all the top.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
There are a lot of good ones.
But this is like, was it last week? Last week I saw Igor Levit perform Shostakovich's 24 Preludes and Fugues, and nobody asked him for encores. So no, this was it.
Fair enough. Well, you pointed to some great passages. Thank you very much for this, Mitch. I think David.
Thank you, Jeff. You were great. This was great. It was great fun talking to you. Thank you, everybody, for coming, asking questions, being interested, showing interest. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Jeff.
Thanks,
and
Mitch.
Mitch. Thanks a lot.
Thank
People who are interested, go buy Mitch's translation, and or I guess people are interested in the biography. I assume Jeff's biography is in print, so or buy both of them.
I just put
and,
the link to Mitch's book in the chat.
Okay, and otherwise, keep checking our website, marxedproject.org, for we have a couple other good events coming up. You want to say anything about any particular events, Fred?
I want to encourage people to look up the details on Max Haven's event on palm oil, the Greek Empire. I think it's going to be a really good talk on this coming weekend, Saturday afternoon. And so far, surprisingly, few people have signed up for it. So you all come, please.